Hey everyone, this is my second video in a series called Questions for Full Preterists. And in the first video, I interacted with the text of Luke 21:22. These are the days of vengeance, that all things written may be fulfilled. And I asked the question if the full preterist interpretation of this verse could be consistently held in looking in passages in Luke 18 and Acts 13 to demonstrate that a consistent hermeneutic would not allow for a dogmatic assertion that all things written has to be every single prophecy in the Old Testament without regards to the context. I want to interact with that just briefly before I get into my second question. If you go to Genesis 24:66, we read, "The servant told Isaac all the things that he had done." And what you can do here in similar fashion is say that the servant told Isaac everything he had ever done from the time of his birth, but we know that in context, Genesis 24, what is being talked about or alluded to is in regards to the servant finding Rebekah for Isaac, finding him a wife. So what I'm advocating, which I think is a more practical and contextual hermeneutic, is to allow the context to tell us if all things mean every single thing or every single thing of a particular. For another example, if we go to Matthew 13:41, we're going to see Jesus and explaining one of his parables says that the Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness. And in the King James Version, all stumbling blocks is all things that offend. And we know from the gospel parables that the field is the world. So if we have to dogmatically assert that all things means every single thing, then when we apply this text or apply the full preterist hermeneutic of this text, the system kind of falls down on itself, because that did not happen. All things that offend were not gathered out of the world. It didn't happen. So I say let's let the context drive our interpretations. Let's not take and stomp our feet down and say it means this and then interpret the rest of the New Testament based on a foundation that is very shaky to begin with. Okay, enough with that. I'd still like to see some more responses to that first question, but I want to go on to question number 2 for full preterists. And I'm going to ask, and we'll get into some scriptures, what is the contrast being made in Scripture? Is there a contrast between the spiritual and the physical, or rather is the contrast the spiritual and the natural? I see as another pillar, foundation of full preterist belief system, that the spiritual and the physical are in antithesis with each other. So I want to go to some text, present some things, and ask some questions. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 2. Okay. Verses 14 and 15. But a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them, because they are spiritually appraised. But he who is spiritual appraises all things, yet he himself is appraised by no one. The contrast here is the spiritual man versus the natural man. Question: is the spiritual man in context physical? Does he have a physical body? Is the spiritual man that Paul is speaking about, is he a physical, fleshly creature? Is the natural man a fleshly creature? I would say it seems apparent and obvious that in both cases they are material, physical. And so the contrast here is not spiritual and physical. They're not opposed to each other. The spiritual man is also a physical man. And if we go later in this same letter to chapter 10, and I'll read verses 1 through 4. It says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ." My question here is that manna, which Paul is referring to, that the Israelites ate, was it material and physical? Was the water they drank that they got from the rock, was it material and physical? I think we would all agree that it was. And yet Paul says that this material, physical food and drink was spiritual, leading us to the inevitable conclusion that the spiritual is not in contrast with the physical. Taking these two verses and looking at that, we eventually get to 1 Corinthians 15. We've already established, or Paul rather has already established, that the spiritual is in contrast with the natural, but the spiritual also is physical. You can be physical and spiritual. So when we get to 1 Corinthians 15, we have a contrast that if you prove that the resurrection is spiritual, which it is, you still have not eliminated it being physical. You have to prove that it's not natural. In Romans 8, Paul says, I think it's verse 9. Let me just go read it. It's always best to read it. Speaking to the Romans, he says, "However, you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed of the Spirit of God dwells in you." So Paul is speaking to physical, material men like you and I, and says you are in the Spirit if the Spirit of God dwells in you. You are not in the flesh. From verses like these, we can understand that Paul's concept of being in the flesh and in the Spirit has nothing to do with immaterial versus material at all. It is a person's mind and action and attitude toward God versus the natural man who's in hostility to God. That's what I want to advocate. When you think that something is spiritual, don't accept the concept that the spiritual is in contrast with the physical, because that is not a Hebrew thought. That is not the way Jesus nor any of the disciples nor anyone versed in the Hebrew scriptures would have thought. Sometimes Paul is misinterpreted and taken out of context based on the Greek language or preconceived Greek ideas that in the earlier church formed into Gnostic beliefs based on some of these misunderstandings in Paul, which Peter warns about. And their concept of material and spiritual were antithesis with each other. But I think if we examine it closely, we see that the natural man is in contrast with the spiritual man. And if our belief system is founded also on a contrast between a material and an immaterial, which is not really found when you exegete the passages, then we should re-examine what we think there. That's what I'm advocating. Re-examine the text. Where does the scripture actually, in context, pit spiritual versus physical? If it's spiritual, then it can't be physical. That's the big question I have. Thanks for watching. God bless you all.